It was dark and damp on the evening of May 29th, 1945. The sun had set, and given that World War II had ended only 3 weeks prior, electricity and gas had not yet returned to Amsterdam, a city that had suffered more than most during what would become known as the Hunger Winter. But standing outside the ornate 18th century mansion at Keizersgracht 321, Lieutenant Joseph Pillar might have thought the roaring 20s were still in full swing. Light spilled from the windows. The canal reflected it back. In a city still eating tulip bulbs to survive, someone in this house had not missed a meal. At 9 p.m., he knocked on the door. The man who answered was small and silver-haired, with the composed, slightly theatrical air of someone accustomed to being looked at. Pillar made quick work of introducing himself as an officer of the new provisional government. But why, he asked, had this man's name been connected to the sale of a Vermeer to Hermann Goering? The man looked at him and said he was unable to provide any details. "Well then, how are you able to afford a place like this?" Pillar asked. "I sold a group of Flemish paintings before the war started," the man replied. Pillar sensed he wasn't getting the whole truth, so he and his backup arrested the man on the spot, walking him through the streets at gunpoint toward Vetteringschans prison. The city was still raw with the release of occupation, and people lined the streets to heckle those being marched through, throwing rocks, letting off steam at anyone accused of being a Nazi, a sympathizer, or a collaborator. The man remained completely stoic. He maintained that same composure through nearly 2 weeks in prison and a full 24 hours of uninterrupted questioning. It was only when Pillar, growing desperate, invented a story that Goring's henchman Alois Miedel was about to swear to the Allies under oath that the man had gone to his gallery specifically to do business with high-ranking Germans, that he finally cracked. But not in the way anyone expected. "I did it. I painted it," the man said. His name was Han van Meegeren, a middling painter who had nonetheless managed to fool the entire art establishment and some of the most powerful Nazi officials in Europe into believing that Vermeer had a secret biblical period early in his career. All of the leading experts in the field had come to believe that the 6 paintings he had made were authentic, even those who had initially doubted it. And now, faced with Van Meegeren's confession, only Pillar was ready to believe him. Because if Van Meegeren was telling the truth, it meant their connoisseurship was not as infallible as they had always assumed. And that was simply impossible. But perhaps the most interesting part of this story is that the Vermeers were not the greatest forgery Van Meegeren ever made. It was himself. Backed against a wall, accused rightly of dealing with the Nazis, Van Meegeren managed to turn himself into the ultimate Dutch folk hero. But in doing so, he buried the parts of his story that make it truly shocking. Han van Meegeren's story is one many people think they know. An overlooked and subsequently bitter artist decides to get revenge on those who never appreciated him by forging the world's most coveted painter. He sells one to Hermann Goering, confesses heroically, and becomes a national icon, ranked as the second most popular man in the Netherlands in 1947, behind only the newly elected Prime Minister. There is quite a bit of truth in that version, but it is a clean, easy version of who Van Meegeren really was. Because what actually happened went on for far longer and for far more nefarious reasons than most people ever realized. I'm Emma Laramie, and this is Verso. Han van Meegeren was born in the provincial town of Deventer, the third of 5 children, raised by a stern Catholic schoolmaster of a father. In 1907, his father sent him to Delft to study architecture, and although he showed some promise in the field, he often shirked his studies, preferring to spend his time drawing instead. Then, in 1911, while still in school, he got a woman named Anna pregnant. His father was naturally incensed, especially because Anna was not Catholic, and agreed to the marriage only on the condition that Anna's parents consented to raise her as a Catholic. They did. Anna and Han were soon married, and their son Jacques born not long after, though the marriage would be anything but happy. In 1917, Van Meegeren and his wife moved from Delft to The Hague. At the time, it wasn't a financial or economic hub like Amsterdam or Rotterdam, but it was known for its elite atmosphere of unapologetic opulence. And it was this atmosphere that made Van Meegeren feel immediately at home, like a caged bird finally set free. He was a showman at heart, practically a prerequisite for a forger, and he was known for his theatrical personality and his innate ability to move among the upper crust despite not belonging to their tax bracket. Shortly after his arrival, he was admitted to the Haagse Kunstkring, a social club that hosted a range of creative events, and he quickly made something of a name for himself by producing photorealistic charcoal drawings of guests at the club's parties and taking on higher-level portrait commissions. That same year, Van Meegeren had his first solo show under his own name, and critics were genuinely impressed. He showed a range of contemporary subjects: women holding parasols, horse-drawn carriages on city streets. And there was a freedom and a looseness to them that would never really be seen in Van Meegeren's work again, real or fake. Those who saw the paintings believed that he had real promise, that he was someone who could carry the Great Hague school tradition forward into the modern era. The Hague was also where his drinking made itself known. One friend observed that Van Meegeren could be quite amusing due to his biting, cynical sense of humor, but only up to a certain point. And that was the point of drunkenness. He would go on gin-fueled tirades that shocked and frightened his friends. But one woman who knew how to keep pace with him was his friend's wife, Johanna. Johanna was an actress, though not a particularly successful one. Not that her spending habits would have made that clear. She was extravagant and unafraid of making a scene, and Van Meegeren was drawn to her like a moth to a flame. Their affair would become a lifelong partnership, but it may also have been one of the reasons he turned to forgery in the first place. He needed the money to keep up with her tastes. The people who knew him in the 1920s described him as an actor, moving from one role to another as it suited him. High-minded artist, bohemian playboy, reactionary, heroic forger. At this point, he was just a man looking for his identity, and he hadn't found it yet. But the problem with forgery, which he'd begun quietly pursuing in the 1920s, is that it shot him in the foot. He became so embroiled in emulating the past that he couldn't bring anything new to his own work. And so it became like an Ouroboros. His mediocre career drove him toward forgery. Forgery made him incapable of making better art, which further convinced him that the establishment was out to get him, and so on, around and around. But before we get to the 6 biblical Vermeers that would make Van Meegeren famous, which were the only 6 that he admitted to making in his lifetime, it's worth understanding why Vermeer was such an attractive target in the first place. Vermeer had been largely forgotten for nearly 2 centuries after his death, his work misattributed, overlooked, and occasionally sold for almost nothing. His rediscovery in the latter half of the 19th century turned him into one of the most celebrated painters in history almost overnight. They were seen as luminous and intimate, almost impossibly rare. Only a few dozen works were attributed to him, which was part of the mystique and also part of the problem. The fewer the paintings, the more people wanted to find new ones, and by the mid-1920s, all the Vermeers that would ever be found had almost certainly been found. But nobody realized it yet. Hunting for a new one had become the art world's equivalent of searching for the Holy Grail, and it reached a fever pitch in the 1920s. This is the environment Van Meegeren stepped into. And although the paintings he would eventually become famous for were produced entirely by himself, he was not always a one-man show. We don't know exactly how they met, but Van Meegeren learned the tricks of the trade from a devilish man named Theo van Wijngaarden, a self-taught, barely literate house painter from Rotterdam who had taught himself to paint and discovered he had more of a knack for making paintings look old than making new things of his own. He knew what he was good at, and he knew that Van Meegeren's talents could help him enormously. The two fell in together around 1920 and spent 12 years, first as employer and employee, then as partners. But Van Meegeren and Van Wijngaarden were different from other forgers, and that was because they had a trick up their sleeve. Most forgers of the period weren't going for the big guys. Usually, they were trying to dupe a casual buyer into thinking they were getting a middle-of-the-road picture, not a masterpiece. And for good reason. The more valuable the work, the more questions people asked. And the thing about oil paint is that it takes years, sometimes decades, to fully dry, making it easy to tell if a painting was made 5 years ago when it was supposed to have been made 300 years ago. Conservators would test works by placing a small dab of alcohol on an inconspicuous corner. If the oil was fully dry, nothing happened. Still wet? Dead giveaway. Van Wijngaarden had found a workaround, though. A medium made from gelatin glue that mimicked the body and texture of oil paint, but dried far faster. He could age a canvas convincingly, but his technical abilities had limits. Van Meegeren had the brushwork, so together they could do what nobody else had seriously attempted. Crack open the high end of the market, landing fakes with the field's most powerful authenticators and selling them to huge collectors like Andrew Mellon. Not flea market bargains. Masterpieces. But to do this, they had to navigate a system that had been tightening since a previous forgery scandal involving a dealer named Leo Nardis had made the market deeply suspicious. After Nardis, it had become nearly impossible to sell any old master without authentication from a recognized authority. For Dutch paintings, that meant Wilhelm van Bode or his rival Hofstede de Groot. Van Meegeren had to fool not just buyers, but the gatekeepers. And he managed it multiple times. The early Vermeers this duo made were more conventionally Vermeer than the biblical works Van Meegeren would later become famous for. Women at instruments, figures in that soft Dutch interior light. But they lacked the real Vermeer tremor, that impossible sense that the painting knows something you don't. But they were accomplished enough to fool serious people. His first attempt, The Girl with the Blue Bow, was rejected not on grounds of forgery, but because Vermeer wasn't known to have painted commissioned portraits. His second, The Smiling Girl, was painted almost entirely to the sensibilities of Wilhelm van Bode, director of the Kaiser Friedrich Museum, a man who relished his insider status and had spent a career trading favors with dealers. Bode authenticated it, and wrote exclusively to the Duveen brothers, the most powerful art dealers in the world, to offer it to them. Van Meegeren's third attempt, The Lace Maker, also sailed past Bode and eventually reached Andrew Mellon. Van Meegeren learned something crucial from this process. The experts had reputations to protect. Once an authority put his name to an attribution, he became invested in it in a way that had nothing to do with the painting and everything to do with himself. This lesson would be confirmed spectacularly in 1923. That year, Van Meegeren and Van Wijngaarden got greedy. Auction houses could get far better prices than private sales, but consigning something at auction required a credible seller. So Van Meegeren recruited a school friend to pose as the owner and brought a fake Frans Hals, known as the Laughing Cavalier, to Hofstede de Groot for authentication. De Groot authenticated it enthusiastically. Then the scientific analysis came back, and the results made the attribution impossible. In a reasonable world, this would have caused the man to quietly revise his opinion. De Groot instead went to war. He argued publicly that a connoisseur's judgment should be taken as gospel, regardless of what laboratory evidence suggested, that the trained eye superseded the test tube. The case became a newspaper sensation, dragged through the courts for 2 years, and ended only when a settlement was reached and de Groot agreed to buy the painting himself. His reputation never fully recovered. But what Van Meegeren took away from the whole episode was more valuable than anything he could have confessed. De Groot had been wrong. The painting was a fake. The science proved it. But rather than quietly revise his opinion, he dug in his heels and made it worse, turning a private embarrassment into a public spectacle. The affair didn't just damage de Groot. It exposed something structural. That the entire system of authentication rested on the unquestioned authority of a few powerful men, and that those men, when challenged, would prioritize their own reputations over the truth. An expert who admitted error was no longer an expert. The system required them to be infallible, which meant the system could be played. Nevertheless, Van Meegeren and Van Wijngaarden pulled back, working through an experienced operator who handled intermediaries and sales, keeping their own fingerprints at a remove. And Van Meegeren, who couldn't help himself, would occasionally let slip to someone at a party that he had been the one who painted the Laughing Cavalier. Out of frustration, probably, that something he'd made was being celebrated while his legitimate work sat unnoticed. But he filed all of this information away. For him, this wasn't a problem. It was a door. In 1922, Van Meegeren had his second solo exhibition. Hinting at where he would eventually end up in his forgery career, he showed paintings of scenes from both the Old and New Testaments, with an awkward theatricality to them. Religious paintings were not exactly the height of fashion in The Hague during the Jazz Age, and already it was clear that Van Meegeren's immersion in other artists' work was beginning to infect the paintings he put his own name on. They were so obviously riffs of other painters that everyone could see it, which only deepened the awkwardness. Critics took note, commenting on their lack of creative inner life and puzzling over how the man with a reputation as the life of every party could be the same man behind these stiff religious canvases. It was clear that Van Meegeren had the technical skill, but not the clarity of vision to make it as an artist in his own right. And some of that may have been a direct consequence of his forgery work. He was not a man who was good at multitasking. When he was deep in producing the work of other artists, his own art suffered. When he focused on his own art, his forgeries got lazy. After he was finally caught, Van Meegeren would claim that it was the scorn for this exhibition that set him on the path to making fools of the world's greatest art experts. But the men who would ultimately become the butt of his joke had nothing to do with the fate of his legitimate artistic career. They didn't review exhibitions, and they had no influence over the contemporary art scene. They were simply scholars of the Dutch Golden Age. Nor was his 1922 exhibition actually that poorly received. Journalists felt he had lost his way somewhat, but not that he was entirely without talent. And most of the paintings had found buyers anyway, so clearly there was some demand for them. But the fact that this purported motivation has stuck to the Van Meegeren story for so long speaks to his ability to craft his own image to suit his own aims, to show people what they wanted to see in him, the same way he showed people what they wanted to find in Vermeer. Ultimately, Van Meegeren did what he did because forgery was a reliable source of money, because he had backed himself into a creative and intellectual corner, and forgery was the easy way out. And he fooled who he fooled, because they were in his way. The chip on his shoulder, born of being perceived as a mediocre painter of inoffensive images while secretly achieving prices even Picasso couldn't hit, found its outlet in the magazine he founded in 1928, known as the Fighting Cock. This was also where the seeds of Van Meegeren's Nazi sympathies first made themselves known, and where the first glimmers of his biblical Vermeers began to take shape. The magazine's tenor was born out of the still young, but growing, right-wing thinking in the Netherlands. Run alongside his childhood acquaintance Jan Ubenck, its stated intellectual mission was to define, purify, and carry forth the cultural tradition that had once made the Netherlands great. A tradition the pair believed was rooted in an embrace of Catholicism and a rejection of modernity. Van Meegeren referred to modern artists as, quote, a slimy bunch of women haters and Negro lovers, end quote, and quoted almost directly from Hitler's Mein Kampf when he spoke of the, quote, spiritual sickness of modernism, end quote. Thankfully for Van Meegeren, most of his more liberal friends paid very little attention to the magazine, which would later allow him to pretend as though he had never shared any beliefs with the Nazis at all. But it did give him a reputation for his sharp tongue, and his friends in the Liberal Party began to distance themselves from him, wary of getting swept up in his bitter arguments. So when a board seat opened up at the Haagse Kunstring in 1932, Jan Ubenck immediately nominated Van Meegeren for the position. Part of the reasoning may have been that the club had taken on substantial debts from a benefactor to fund a new headquarters, and it was thought that Van Meegeren's connections might help settle them. But a vocal faction of junior members felt he was the wrong choice entirely and threatened to resign en masse if he was elected. Two of them went directly to the benefactor and struck a deal. In exchange for a selection of works by member artists, he would forgive the club's debts. With the money issue resolved, any leverage Van Meegeren had evaporated, and his candidacy was easily blocked. The debacle so deeply humiliated him that, coupled with the lingering sting of his poorly received show a decade earlier, he decided to leave The Hague altogether, relocating with Johanna to the French Riviera, where he would begin producing and distributing forgeries entirely on his own. The benefactor who had inadvertently helped block his path was a man named Abraham Bredius. In a few years, that name would mean everything to Van Meegeren. By the time Van Meegeren had settled on the French Riviera and fixed his sights on Vermeer, the foremost living authority on the Dutch Golden Age was an elderly, eminent man named Abraham Bredius, holding court in his Monaco villa with the satisfaction of a man who had spent a long career being right. He was a roundish figure with thin, wavy hair, a wispy mustache, and small round glasses that gave him the air of a quizzical owl. A misleading appearance because Bredius thrived on conflict. For 20 years, he had served as director of the Mauritshuis Museum in The Hague, a position that gave him both a platform and a large cast of colleagues to battle. He had feuded bitterly and publicly with Hofstede de Groot for decades, and continued the feud even after de Groot's death. Nevertheless, his record as a connoisseur was genuinely impressive. He had spotted Rembrandt's Polish Rider hanging in obscurity and brought it to the world's attention. He had been the first to praise Girl with a Pearl Earring in print. He had discovered 3 different Vermeers, an almost unthinkable achievement given how few actually exist. And he had come from enough family wealth that, unlike de Groot and Bode, he had never needed to sell authentication certificates for income. But he had watched those men accrue enormous power through that work, and once they were both dead, Bredius saw his opportunity to carry that torch himself. He also had a theory. Over the course of his career, he had become the primary champion of the idea that Vermeer had an early religious period, inspired by Italian painters like Caravaggio, a phase that would have predated the luminous domestic interiors the world knew him for. As evidence, he pointed to 2 known biblical works that bore Vermeer's signatures: Christ in the House of Martha and Mary, whose authentication he had played a significant role in, and the Allegory of Faith, which he had personally discovered in a Berlin gallery in 1899 and later purchased for his own collection. He had, in effect, spent decades theorizing a specific kind of painting into existence, a painting that, as yet, no one had found. Van Meegeren knew all of this, and working alone in France, he had also solved a technical problem that had kept forgers away from the highest tier of the art market. The gelatin glue medium he and Van Wijngaarden had used in the 1920s had served them well enough, but it had its vulnerabilities. Now, Van Meegeren had found something better: bakelite. A synthetic resin used industrially in everything from telephone handsets to costume jewelry, bakelite had a property that made it almost miraculous for forgery. When fully hardened, it was impervious to virtually any test a conservator could apply. The alcohol that would have exposed a fresh oil painting did nothing to it. Ground with period-appropriate pigments and applied to authentic 17th century canvases stripped of their original images, bakelite paint could be baked hard in a makeshift plywood oven until it was indistinguishable to both eye and test from centuries-old oil. The canvas was then rolled around a cylinder to produce convincing craquelure, the fine network of cracks that signal age, and darkened with dirt and ink. The solution was so complete that it essentially eliminated the technical barrier that had kept forgers away from the highest tier of the market for decades. Van Meegeren now had the brushwork, the historical knowledge, and the chemistry. What he needed was the right target. He decided to test Bredius before going for broke. Around 1932, as he was settling into life on the Riviera, he painted The Gentleman and Lady at the Spinet, modeled directly on the Allegory of Faith, borrowing its compositional elements deliberately, designed to confirm what Bredius already believed about Vermeer's range. Bredius authenticated it enthusiastically. And emboldened, he brought it to Joseph Duveen, one of the most powerful dealers in the world, expecting a triumph. But Duveen passed. He thought it was fake. Bredius was incensed and interpreted Duveen's rejection as a personal slight rather than a professional judgment. The irony was exquisite. Bredius had actually written an article in the Burlington magazine in 1932 arguing that several Vermeers from the 1920s, including The Smiling Girl, painted by Van Meegeren, which Duveen himself had dealt with, were forgeries. Now Duveen was returning the favor. Bredius eventually managed to place The Gentleman and Lady through a smaller gallery, the kind of house that had every incentive to take on a work the major dealers had passed on, if only to prove that they could run with the best. But the Duvian slight festered. What Van Meegeren understood from all of this was that Bredius was now primed. He owned the allegory of faith. He had staked his reputation on Vermeer's religious period. He had authenticated the gentleman and lady at the spinet and been publicly humiliated for it. And he was not the kind of man to make the same mistake twice, which meant that the next time a biblical Vermeer appeared, he would defend it to the death. This was the element of forgery Van Meegeren understood better than anyone. You had to give people what they already wanted to see, and you had to make it feel like something they had been waiting for their entire lives. Bredius had theorized this painting into existence. All Van Meegeren had to do was paint it. In 1936, Van Meegeren attended the Berlin Olympics. Nazi cultural production was everywhere, on the walls, in the streets, in the architecture of the games themselves. He returned to his villa in France and began painting The Supper at Emmaus. Picture the studio, the 17th century canvas he had sourced, stripped of its original image, its age cracks already built in. The period authentic props arranged on a table, a silver platter, a ceramic jug, a piece of glassware, copied from known Vermeers he had studied obsessively. The small jars of pigments he had ground himself, mixed into liquid bakelite rather than oil, applied in careful touches with a large dry brush before the resin became too tacky to work with. And then the oven, a makeshift box of plywood, heated with an electric coil, in which the finished canvas would be slowly warmed until the bakelite hardened to something a conservator would swear was 3 centuries old. Then the rolling of the canvas around a cylinder to deepen the craquelure, the rubbing of ink and dirt into the cracks. The whole process was painstaking, laborious, and utterly without glamour. But the Emmaus was his most ambitious work yet, and he gave it everything he had. On its surface, the painting was a masterclass in studied Vermeer. The highlights on the bread, the extravagant ultramarine blue, the table objects placed just so. But Van Meegeren was doing something else too, something he may have only half-consciously understood. The painting has a heaviness to it, a solemn peasant gravity that has less to do with 17th century Delft than with the visual language saturating Europe in the late 1930s. This is what the Germans called the Volksgeist, literally the spirit of the people, a concept central to Nazi ideology and to the art it produced. Idealized depictions of rural life, ancient national character, the pure and rooted peasant as the embodiment of a people's soul. The figures in the supper at Emmaus gather around the table with the same weighted stillness as the farming families in German propaganda paintings of the period. Christ himself carries the gravity of a Teutonic ideal. Van Meegeren was painting a Nazi fantasy of Vermeer, whether he fully knew it or not. This is the insight that allowed the public to misunderstand the complexity of Van Meegeren for decades. The forgeries didn't just exploit a gap in the historical record, they exploited the visual culture of the moment. The best forgeries don't merely mimic the style of a dead artist. They reflect the tastes and attitudes of the period in which they're being made, in ways the viewer feels but cannot name. In 1937, in a Europe already saturated in that imagery, the supper at Emmaus didn't read as strange. It read as mysteriously exactly right. Now Van Meegeren needed to get it to Bredius. And for that, he needed someone Bredius would trust. He found his man in Gerard Boon, a member of the Dutch Liberal Party, whom Van Meegeren had recently rekindled a friendship with. Boone was earnest, well-connected, and genuinely anti-fascist. Precisely the kind of person Van Meegeren needed, and precisely the kind of person he was willing to use without hesitation. The story that Van Meegeren told him was this. He had Dutch friends living in Italy who were being terrorized by Mussolini's government. They needed to sell a painting from their family collection to raise money for their escape, but Italy's strict export controls meant they could never bring it to market themselves. Would Boone be willing to help? It was the cruelest deception of Van Meegeren's career, an act of betrayal both personal and political, to which the unsuspecting Boone was completely oblivious. A committed anti-fascist, believing he was helping refugees flee a fascist regime, was being used as a vessel to deliver a fascist-coded fake to the most important authenticator in his field. Boone never knew. At least not until the end. He went to Bredius in good faith, and Bredius was delighted to receive him. Bredius had initially harbored some skepticism. He didn't know Boone and contacted a lawyer in The Hague to verify his trustworthiness before proceeding. The lawyer gave Boone a glowing report. And what followed was, by all accounts, an immediate and overwhelming emotional response. Bredius wrote a certificate letter in which he described a painting that had been, quote, rescued, thank God, from the oblivion where it languished for many years undamaged, just as it was when it left the artist's studio, end quote. He went on, quote, when this masterpiece was shown to me, I had difficulty controlling my emotion, end quote. He then published a piece in the Burlington Magazine, the most important publication in Old Master scholarship, declaring The Supper at Emmaus to be the masterpiece of Vermeer's entire career. Not everyone agreed, though. When Boone brought the painting to the Duveen brothers, offering it for £70,000, their representatives examined it and sent photographs to the director of the Rijksmuseum, who cabled back 4 words: "Picture a rotten fake." Boone relayed this to Bredius, who was incensed, and interpreted Duveen's rejection as a vendetta. Payback for the earlier Burlington Magazine article in which he had called out some of Duveen's own Vermeers as forgeries. So he became more determined than ever to place the painting with a prestigious Dutch buyer. His candidate was Dirk Hannema, director of the Boymans Museum in Rotterdam, who had come up under Bredius's wing and was not the most rigorous scholar, but had connections and liked big splashy pictures. Hannema was immediately besotted, dismissing the Rijksmuseum director's verdict as the opinion of a fool who had never seen the work in person. Bredius and Hannema together convinced the Rembrandt Society, a private organization dedicated to funding major acquisitions for Dutch public museums, to purchase it. Bredius even contributed his own authentication fee towards the sale. The Rijksmuseum director, eventually persuaded to view it in person, reversed his position entirely and pronounced it genuine. And the sale was completed on Christmas Day, 1937. Shortly afterwards, the Rijksmuseum director began having second thoughts. He wanted the painting for the Rijksmuseum now, and offered the Boymans a real Vermeer, mistress and maid with a letter, in exchange. Hannema turned him down. To celebrate the acquisition, he mounted a lavish exhibition called 4 Centuries of Dutch Art, with The Supper at Emmaus as its centerpiece, reproduced on every bit of promotional material. With the proceeds, Van Meegeren purchased a 12-bedroom estate outside Nice, its walls hung with genuine old masters. He hadn't really painted a convincing fake, though. He had painted the painting Bredius had spent his entire career hoping to find, the proof of his own lifelong theory, wrapped in the visual language of the moment. And once someone else got on board, suddenly everyone else agreed. Of course it was accepted. They were never looking at a Vermeer. They were looking at a mirror. Van Meegeren returned to the Netherlands in September 1939, expecting neutrality. The Dutch had stayed out of the First World War, and he saw no reason to think this one would be different. He was wrong. Germany occupied the Netherlands in May 1940, and Van Meegeren, rather than finding himself trapped in a nightmare, found himself at the center of an opportunity. The wartime art market was chaos in the most profitable sense possible. Currency was difficult to move across borders, so everyone with money was converting it into portable, durable assets: gemstones, gold, and above all, paintings. Works of every variety changed hands at speed. Cash transactions were routine, and provenance questions were met with a collective incuriosity. Loyalists paid premiums to keep valuable works out of German hands. Germans paid premiums to acquire trophy works. The atmosphere was one in which commerce and pillage cohabitated with both unease and nonchalance. For a talented, hard-working forger in what had become a robber's El Dorado, the stars had never been so perfectly aligned. And under his own name, Van Meegeren was thriving too. He exhibited in Nazi-sponsored shows in the Netherlands and Germany. He donated substantial sums to the German Red Cross and the Winterhulp, an organization that billed itself as a relief agency but was denounced by the Dutch resistance as a militaristic slush fund. He did all of this of his own free will. The Nazi occupation had cleared the field of the modern artists he despised and opened a door he had long been waiting for. A chance to reinvent himself as a legitimate painter under a regime that shared his aesthetic values. He never formally joined the Dutch Nazi Party because he knew that would make his sympathies impossible to deny later should things go wrong. He had always been careful about what he couldn't take back. His forgeries during this period moved through a rotating cast of middlemen. A real estate agent, a childhood classmate he tracked down through a school reunion album and cultivated over a weekend visit, a Nazi-friendly banker who had previously owned the mansion at Keizersgracht 321. The paintings he forged cycled through the Hugendijk Gallery, the same gallery that had handled the Emmaus, and those were sold at enormous prices. They were declining in quality, though. Van Meegeren was splitting his attention between his forgery career and his above-ground career, and it showed. But nobody raised any questions because each new painting was being authenticated against the standard of the Emmaus. Once that had been accepted as genuine, the definition of what counted as a Vermeer had expanded to include whatever Van Meegeren chose to put in front of people. His task grew easier as his forgeries grew worse. By 1945, the money he was making had become its own problem. When the occupation government recalled all 1,000 guilder banknotes from circulation, Van Meegeren had to hand over a stack he couldn't explain. He claimed he'd sold paintings before the war, but had no documentation. So he began converting the money into assets: jewelry, art, and mostly real estate. By the time the occupation ended, he owned 57 individual properties in Amsterdam. It was during this buying spree in the summer of 1943 that he acquired the 18th century mansion at Keizersgracht 321. The last and worst of the biblical Vermeers was Christ and the Adulteress, completed in 1943. It was also, of all of them, the most nakedly coded. Its composition appears to have been lifted almost directly from a well-known 1940 painting by the Nazi artist Hans Schauinger, depicting a solemn Austrian family sending the man of the house to the front. In Van Meegeren's version, Christ stands where the soldier stands, with the same weathered gravity, the same atmosphere of sacrifice, just made sacred. He wasn't even bothering to hide it anymore. To move it, Van Meegeren turned to a new intermediary. Petrus Jan Reinstra van Stuyvesant, a Nazi-friendly banker who had actually owned Kaisersgracht 321 before Van Meegeren purchased it, and who had loose ties to the Haussticker gallery, which Alois Miedel was currently co-opting. Van Meegeren gave him the same story he'd given everyone else. An elderly widow in need, a painting to be sold discreetly, and asked him to bring it to Alois Miedel. Reinstra was clever enough to know where his interests really lay, and before he ever went to Miedel, he asked around town about Van Meegeren. What he heard back was unsettling. He was an alcoholic, he possibly had syphilis, he was rumored to be a forger. He went to Miedel anyway, but when Miedel asked him where the painting had come from, Reinstra abandoned Van Meegeren's cover story entirely and gave Miedel his real name. He knew that keeping in good standing with Miedel was worth more than honoring whatever he owed Van Meegeren. Van Meegeren, still in his mansion on the Kaisersgracht, had no idea his intermediary had just handed him over. Miedel was Goring's financial advisor and one of the more consequential figures in the wartime Dutch art market. The man who, in the days immediately following the German occupation of Holland, had gone door to door to Amsterdam's Jewish art collectors and suggested, with the quiet menace of someone who didn't need to raise his voice, that it would be better to sell to him at his prices than to wait for the Gestapo to confiscate everything. Goring had standing instructions. He had the right of first refusal on any Vermeer Miedel came across. Goring loved the painting, but he refused to release payment until Van Meegeren provided documentation of its provenance. He was horrible in every respect, but meticulous in how he conducted his business affairs. Even the Nazis liked to maintain the appearance of propriety, and at 1.65 million guilders, this was about to become the most expensive painting in Goring's collection, and one of the most expensive works of art ever sold. He wanted the paperwork to reflect well on everyone involved. Van Meegeren stalled, but it didn't work for long. In February 1944, Reinstra arrived at Kaisersgracht 321 with a typewriter and a stack of blank paper, and instructions from Miedel not to leave until Van Meegeren had produced a letter. What Van Meegeren wrote was a masterpiece of studied ambiguity. He agreed to reveal the name of the painting's owner within 2 years of the purchase date, a promise that satisfied everyone because each party read a different meaning into it. Miedel and Goring wanted cover in case uncomfortable questions arose after the war. The letter gave culpability to Van Meegeren and none to them. Van Meegeren was satisfied because the focus remained on the question of stolen provenance, not forgery. And he was able to kick the can down the road. Nobody was asking whether or not the painting was real. And so eventually, the sale went through. Both Van Meegeren and Reinstra would later claim they never intended the painting to reach Goring. That appears kind of true. But it doesn't change what it was. A fascist sympathizer who had spent the occupation exhibiting under Nazi patronage and donating to Nazi-affiliated organizations, selling a painting coated with Nazi imagery to the man who had orchestrated the looting of Dutch Jewish art collections. For Van Meegeren, this was not a moral crisis. It was a business transaction that had gone further than intended. We are, of course, back where we started. May 1945. The mansion, the arrest, the walk through the streets. Van Meegeren holding out for 24 hours of uninterrupted questioning before Pillar's invented threat about Miedel breaks him. And when he finally speaks, the experts who had authenticated his work refused to believe him. The conservator who had cleaned the Emmaus after the Boymans purchased it said Van Meegeren was lying. So did the museum director, who had reversed himself and declared it genuine. They could not afford to believe him. An expert who could be wrong was no longer an expert at all, and they had built careers on being infallible. Bredius, notably, couldn't be reached for comment. He had died in Monaco in January 1946 before the case went to trial, the only major figure in the whole affair who never had to publicly reckon with what he had done. He went to his grave having declared The Supper at Emmaus the masterpiece of Vermeer's career, and the world, for the time being, had agreed with him. Joseph Piller was a different problem in the whole situation. He was brilliant, and he genuinely believed Van Meegeren. But he was also a man who had barged into a case that wasn't his, and who had staked his reputation on being the one to crack it open. His colleagues in the new Dutch government found him obstructive, self-promoting, and chronically insubordinate. He was a lion in wartime and a menace as a peacetime bureaucrat, and he knew that his authority in the Van Meegeren case rested entirely on the story he could tell about it. When Van Meegeren described himself as an outcast who had wanted to prove himself against a more powerful establishment, Piller heard his own biography. He decided what kind of story this was going to be, and he set about making it. On July 12, 1945, Piller sat down with Van Meegeren and drafted the press statement they would release together. In it, Van Meegeren declared, quote, "Driven into a state of anxiety and depression due to the all too meager appreciation of my work, I decided, one fateful day, to revenge myself on the art critics and experts by doing something the likes of which the world had never seen before." End quote. This was entirely assembled from the parts of the mythology Van Meegeren had been constructing about himself for years. Piller released it to the press without informing the civilian detective division that was supposed to have jurisdiction over the case. He wanted full credit, and he wanted the story locked in before anyone else could complicate it. The public reaction was immediate and volcanic. The forgery story knocked dispatches about the still ongoing Pacific War off the front pages of Dutch newspapers. And the papers were initially uncertain about how to frame Van Meegeren. Making a fool of Goering certainly made him popular, but it naturally raised questions about why he had been doing business with Goring's people in the first place. Those questions didn't stay unanswered for long. 3 weeks after the press statement, a journalist published a photograph of an illustrated book of drawings Van Meegeren had published in 1942, which had been found in Hitler's personal library. Inside the front cover, in Van Meegeren's own handwriting, was, quote, "To my beloved Führer in grateful tribute from H. Van Meegeren, North Holland, 1942, end quote. After Van Meegeren publicly came out to explain that he had signed many copies of that volume, but that another Nazi must have written the actual inscription, the journalist painstakingly tracked down the original and published it again with the inscription confirmed. People were angry, letters were written, and the discovery landed with a real force in a country still raw from 5 years of occupation, where the question of who had collaborated and who had resisted was not abstract, but deeply, bitterly personal. But Piller was, by this point, too invested to change course, and Van Meegeren was too charming to stay in the dock for long. Piller released him from prison and installed him under house arrest at the Goustiger Gallery, which Piller had made his office. He also asked Van Meegeren to start painting a new Vermeer, practical proof that he was capable of what he claimed, and useful cover for Piller, who needed his judgment publicly vindicated. Van Meegeren set up his easel and went to work, and word spread quickly that the forger was painting. Journalists came to watch. Artists came, members of the public came. And Van Meegeren, who had spent his whole adult life performing for whatever room he happened to be in, gave them everything they wanted. He was witty and self-deprecating, generous with his time, and endlessly entertaining about the mechanics of the con, how he'd mixed the paints, built the oven, chosen his subjects. He let people watch him work, making them feel like insiders. So by the time he had finished, most of the people who had been in that room had quietly decided that whatever he might have written in a book dedication, this was not the kind of man the War Crimes Tribunal was designed for. As the weeks passed and the occupation receded even slightly into memory, the anger about the Hitler inscription began to soften. The folk hero story was simply more useful and more enjoyable than the collaborator story, and it only worked if Van Meegeren wasn't a Nazi sympathizer. So, piece by piece, people found their reasons to let that part fall away. Pillar needed a triumph. The Dutch public needed someone who had outwitted the enemy. The art world needed the story to be about Goring's gullibility rather than their mistakes. Even the journalists who had initially published the damning evidence eventually stopped returning to it. Everyone had a reason to look the other way, and eventually enough of them did that the looking away became the consensus. By the time the trial opened on October 29, 1947, the battle for Van Meegeren's reputation was long over, and he had won it. There had already been a well-received novel, a biography, and a children's comic book about him. The word genial followed him everywhere. The trial was almost besides the point. The trial itself actually had the atmosphere of a festive occasion. The witnesses were treated with kid gloves. Gerard Boon, the man Van Meegeren had used most cruelly, who had genuinely believed he was helping anti-fascists and had unknowingly delivered a Nazi-coded fake to the world's most important authenticator, was not required to testify at all. The prosecution never raised Van Meegeren's Nazi sympathies, his wartime exhibitions, or his donations to the Winterholt. The collaborationist atmosphere was kept entirely out of the picture, and what remained was the charming story of a wounded artist and his audacious con. The prosecution had arranged for the conservator A.M. de Wilde to provide scientific testimony. He demonstrated that genuine old oil paint, even when fully hardened, will dissolve when exposed to sodium hydroxide, while bakelite will not. Van Meegeren's paintings were revealed to clearly have been made of bakelite, but that outcome had been obvious before anyone sat down. Van Meegeren was the final witness in his own trial. He rose to his feet with a sheaf of notes and a pair of horn-rimmed reading glasses and delivered the speech he had been rehearsing since the day of his arrest. He had been belittled by critics who didn't know the first thing about art. He had taken immense satisfaction in measuring himself against the greats. He had proven what he always knew about himself. And then, with an air of remorse that was as carefully constructed as everything else about him, he said, quote, "I didn't do it for the money, which brought me nothing but trouble and unhappiness," end quote. When the judge observed that the high prices he had charged rather suggested otherwise, Van Meegeren smiled. If he had sold them for low prices, he said, it would have been obvious they were fake. He was sentenced to 1 year in prison. 2 years was the maximum for forgery under Dutch law, and every asset he owned was seized and distributed to those who had lost money in his sales. He was taken from the courtroom to an Amsterdam clinic, where he died 6 weeks later of heart failure, likely from complications of syphilis. He never served a single day of his sentence. The myth he had so carefully constructed had in the end outlasted him, exactly as he would have wanted. The New York Times ran his obituary on New Year's Eve, quote, "Painter who fooled experts with copies of masters is dead," end quote. There is a silver lining of sorts in all of this. Van Meegeren's confession forced every owner of a recently acquired Vermeer to submit it to fresh scrutiny. Most of the fakes were eventually identified and excised. We now have a far clearer picture of who Vermeer actually was as a painter, partly and painfully because Van Meegeren had distorted that picture so thoroughly that its restoration required starting almost from scratch. The Supper at Emmaus still hangs in the Boymans Museum in Rotterdam today, just correctly labeled. It wouldn't be until 1979 that a Dutch scholar named Marijke van den Brandhoff published research that began to document the full extent of Van Meegeren's Nazi sympathies and collaborationist activities. But even then, it barely shifted the story. The books that had been published about him in the 1960s had actually doubled down on the myth, more adamant than ever that he was entirely anti-Nazi, that the Goring sale had been an act of deliberate heroism. The myth was too well made, too satisfying, and too useful. It did the work Van Meegeren had designed it to do, long after he was gone. Van Meegeren understood something most people would prefer not to examine: that we don't see what's actually in front of us. We see what we've already decided is there. Bredius saw the early Vermeer he had spent decades theorizing into existence. The Dutch public saw the folk hero they desperately needed. Pillar saw a kindred spirit. None of them were fooled by the paintings, not really. They were fooled by their own desire. The forgeries didn't succeed because Van Meegeren was a great painter. They succeeded because desire is a more powerful anesthetic than any technical sophistication. He gave people what they wanted, and they looked no further. He bent the historical record. He altered who scholars thought Vermeer was. He forged not just paintings, but the past itself. And then when the war ended and the walls closed in, he forged himself one final time. Turned the confession that should have destroyed him into the most durable work of his career. He died before anyone could debunk it. His reputation intact, the myth still running. The greatest forgery Han van Meegeren ever made wasn't a Vermeer. It was himself. This episode was written, narrated, and produced by me, Emma Laramie. If you enjoyed this story, if something here surprised you, made you think differently, or just gave you something interesting to talk about over drinks with friends, do me a favor. Follow the show. Leave a rating or a review if you're feeling generous. And if there's an artist or a moment in art history you're curious about, drop a comment below. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.